The 1992 Los Angeles Uprising, the Cambodian genocide, Japanese American incarceration. What you know isn't always the full story. Our new podcast, Inheriting, about Asian American and Pacific Islander families where the past is personal.
Korean Americans, we call it 사이구.
Did you ever realize when you were a child that you became an orphan?
Camp was such a hard time. How do you think you got through it?
Listen to Inheriting from LAist Studios and the NPR network, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey everyone, it's Marvin. Welcome to Books and Boba. This week, Rira and I are taking a quick break to regroup and build up our pipeline for you, but we didn't want to leave you hanging on the feed. So we're dropping in an episode from our fellow PotluckPod. They call us Bruce, and their conversation with OiYan Poon, who is a writer and race scholar and author of the book Asian American is Not a Color, Conversations on Race, Affirmative Action and Family. Hosts Jeff Yang and Phil Yu interviewed OiYan last month for They Call Us Bruce, and had a really great conversation about the role of Asian Americans in politics, as well as how OiYan's daughter inspired her to write the book. So please enjoy this episode of They Call Us Bruce, and we'll be back next week with our regularly scheduled mid-month book news check-in. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you all next week.
Potluck. Popular blogger, Phil Yu.
Hello and welcome to another edition of They Call Us Bruce, an unfiltered conversation about what's happening in Asian America. I'm Phil Yu.
And I'm Jeff Yang, and we are incredibly delighted to welcome a friend of ours, a longtime friend of ours, and a fantastic author, academic leader, great mom, to our podcast. Her name is Dr. OiYan Poon. She is co-director of the College Admissions Collab at University of Maryland College Park and author of the new book, Asian American is Not a Color, Conversations on Race, Affirmative Action, and Family. OiYan, welcome to the podcast.
This is a bucket list for me, man, coming on this show with you guys.
It was inevitable, and I feel like we should have had you on sooner. So apologies for that. But I gotta say to the They Call Us Bruce audience, I mean, OiYan and I go way back. We've now known each other for over 20 years, and I just remember this. Like, one, OiYan was the very first person when she was a student affairs person at UC Davis. She was the very first person to bring me out to do a speaking gig as Angry Asian Man way back in the day, and the first one to open up that possibility to me, like, oh, people want to bring me out and hear from me and do this kind of stuff. Like, that was crazy. And then the other thing I just remembered is that OiYan wrote one of my letters of recommendation for grad school way back in 2004.
Oh my gosh, I forgot about that. Yeah,
I forgot about it too. But I did get into grad school. So yeah, thank you for that.
So, bucket list achieved on many levels, I suppose, but for good reason. I mean, OiYan, you've been such a leading light in so many ways in our community, especially on the front of the topics you're talking about in this book. And I mean, obviously, as somebody who's been in the trenches with you, writing about and covering a lot of the issues that you're also addressing, I didn't know what to expect out of your first book, but whatever I could have possibly expected has been exceeded. I mean, obviously, I knew you were going to write something amazing and important, but I didn't realize you were going to write something so moving and so heartfelt and so deeply personal and intimate. Because I've read your papers before. I've read stuff that you've written.
The boring theoretical things.
Yes. and that stuff's in here. That you actually bring your research to life here, but you frame it in such an incredible way through the lens of kind of a conversation with your daughter, your daughter in the future when she's ready to read this book. It actually, I was telling Phil, it felt a lot like this, if you will, Google ad. That made all of us were Asian American dads cry back when, Dear Sophie, where this father is kind of putting all these things in a digital hope chest for his daughter, Sophie. And this book is written literally as kind of Dear Tay-Tay. And I wanted to, I guess, just jump in and ask you what actually led you to make the book this kind of a story, this kind of a generational story, a parent-child story, a mother-daughter story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you for noticing that. This has been probably the hardest thing I've ever written. Grad school trains you to write in a particular way to get tenure, which I did. I got tenure, yay. But I think I got bored of writing in that way. There's a pretty formulaic way of writing academic papers, and I got pretty good at it, if I might say so myself. But like you said, Jeff, it's not exactly the most sparkling narratives. And so I think what really compelled me to write this was I felt like the people I talked to 36 people, and I felt like the stories that they were telling me were just really compelling. And I wanted to honor those stories that I couldn't honor them in the way I wanted to in academic papers. So I wanted to write a book, but I didn't know how to write a book. And then, when Tay was 3, she started asking lots of questions about the world. And that led to the title of the book and I guess the really kind of the vehicle for the book in writing to her.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
So, yeah.
when you read the book, it's very heartfelt. It's, you've obviously thought a lot about, well, we've had conversations about Asian American identity and race and all this stuff over the years, but it's only in recent years, honestly, where I've been forced to think about it in terms of like being a parent and how my daughter's going to grow up. And we are in the same boat. I mean, our daughters are kind of are around the same age. They've played together before.
They have FaceTime together.
We are going through it, right? We're going through it, especially in the last couple of years, decade. It just feels like we're in the thick of it. And so we've had to confront these conversations through a different lens. And so this book has been, it's just a really great rumination on all of that. And so I really felt it. And I could tell, knowing you and knowing your writing, your previous writing, I could tell you were resisting the urges to bring in academic speak, to bring in that style. Like you just like, no, I'm going to uncuff myself from that and really bring in, you're writing from the heart.
Liberate.
I was wondering if you could actually talk about because what I knew about your book while you were writing it, before it came out, was that it was kind of the central thing was these interviews that you did with these proponents and opponents of affirmative action. And I thought, like, it is the core of the book, but I thought it was going to be much more academic, But could you talk about that research?
Comment. It's not quite as academic.
Could you talk about that research and how it melded with this idea of a letter to your daughter?
Yeah. So these affirmative action debates have been roiling in various conversations throughout the Asian American community across the country. And I think around 2013 was when things got real live in California and trying to overturn bans on affirmative action in California. And we started seeing these mostly Chinese immigrants who were suddenly very civically active and politically engaged and throwing direct action rallies against affirmative action. And it was kind of shocking. I think it threw me for a loop and surprised me. And I didn't understand them. And so I decided to use my research tools to figure out what is happening here. I know it's always been a tense issue, but to see this kind of sudden immigrant civic engagement and political activity was surprising. And so in 2016, I went across the country and reached out to organizations claiming to represent the Asian American community on both sides of the issue, essentially, and asked leaders of these organizations to meet with me and tell me why or how they arrived at feeling the way they do about affirmative action. Basically, there was a list of organizations in amicus briefs in previous legal cases, like the Fisher versus UT Austin case. There was like over 100 organizations that said they were representing Asian Americans and opposed to affirmative action. And then there was another over 100 organizations that also represented Asian Americans and supported affirmative action. And so we went through those lists, my research team and I. It was really easy to find the people who supported affirmative action. They were part of longstanding organizations like Advancing Justice and OCA and so CRAC, et cetera. But on the opposition side, it was really hard to find people because when we were going through the organization, some of them didn't really exist. One of them was I remember was a jewelry shop. And I was like, I don't know how this represents Asian Americans. Another one was like a senior center that didn't serve an Asian American community. But then my research team and I had like a funny debate over like, well, there's a boba shop here. Does that represent Asian Americans? Maybe, arguably, perhaps. But really, there was only a handful of Asian American organizations on the opponent list that we could actually identify and find people to interview. We ended up finding 36, pretty evenly split across the country in Chicagoland, the Northeast, West Coast, Northern, Southern California, and the Pacific Northwest. So these were the people we talked to. I just asked them, how did they arrive at their thoughts on race and racism and what they thought affirmative action was and how it worked and what their ideal policy situations were. And the stories that people told me were really heartfelt and very personal. I was surprised at times the stories that I was getting, and it went way beyond, a wonky policy issue of how people get into fancy pants colleges, Jeff. Although all three of us did attend fancy pants colleges, but I really thought that maybe these conversations when I was doing the research would get really wonky and niche policy, but the stories people were telling me were really about their life stories. So it surprised me, the stories I was getting for people. And it was really about what it meant to be Asian American.
So that was actually one of the things that I felt was most powerful about the book itself, that you were able to actually kind of get inside the heads of people who were significantly, at least vocally, against affirmative action, and understand not just a little bit more deeply the human reasons, the family reasons, even the cultural reasons why they were at least nominally aligned with the forces of anti-affirmative action. But one of the things that came out of that very human portrayal, that very kind of, actually, I think, generous portrayal of these individuals, was a recognition that maybe they weren't actually against affirmative action, that a lot of these people, in fact, their stated causes, the reasons why they were opposed to affirmative action, when you actually look closer, most of them said, I'm actually for some kind of affirmative action, but it turned out that they misinterpreted what affirmative action means or how it's applied, or in some cases, they were theoretically for affirmative action, but felt somehow that it was being misappropriated or misrepresented or misexecuted at the admissions level. And that's interesting. I mean, it really paints a very different picture of the internal conversation in our community. And I'm so glad you were able to actually draw that out, because I don't think that most of the op-eds, including ones that I've written myself, have been quite as sensitive and quite as forgiving. Let me not say forgiving. Have been quite as sensitive.
It was forgiving. It was forgiving.
Okay. Quite as sensitive and quite as forgiving of the positions and attitudes some of these persons take in their rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I struggled. That was the biggest struggle in writing this book, was like trying to give a human portrayal of these people who agreed to spend, in some cases, hours with me and letting me into their lives. And I wanted to honor that, even if I found some of the things they said extremely offensive. The trash talking one person did about my own family. Trash talking.
God.
You're one of those Chinatown folks.
Look, it's been months since I've read the book. But the one thing that has stuck out is that damn guy who was like, how dare, I was like so incensed on your behalf when I read. Okay, anyway, continue.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, no, like one trash talked my family, and then at the end of our interview told me, don't forget, make sure you vote for Hillary and tell all your friends to do the same. It was wild. Or another one who totally trash talked Phil, right? Surprisingly. And I'm like, I should not tell her that I'm friends with him.
Popular blogger Phil Yu. I'm not laughing because you're not a popular blogger, by the way. I think it's hilarious for that to be the frame.
It was a badge of honor. I was like, if Grace from Chicago wants to get mad at me for speaking out in support of Black Lives Matter, then I look, fine. Let's do it. You know, like go for it.
Yeah.
You know, you go and you be mad, Grace.
The scarcity mentality among the folks that I talked to in the policy opponent side was really deep, right? To the point where it was like, you can't be for Black Lives Matter and for Asian American rights, right? So Phil, she has questions for you, right? But that was the mentality, was just like, hey, a lot of these people had gone through a lot of traumas themselves. And the only solution they could see out of, anti-Asian racism was to punch down on other communities of color, which I totally disagreed with. But, I could not deny that they saw racism as a problem like I do, like we do, right? It was just a difference in how we decided to go about addressing the problem. And I think that's what makes them different from, say, Chris Rufo and these other super white supremacist folks. Like this morning, I just heard an interview from one of those guys, and he was like, there's no such thing as racism, except for when it comes to admissions and Asian Americans and white people, right? And that's the difference, right? These white anti-equity folks claim there's no such thing as racism, except for when it's targeted at them. Mm-hmm. And the people I talked to were like, yes, racism is a problem. We face it. Other people face it. And it was just a disagreement in how we go about solving the problem. And I feel like that's like I wanted to call in our community, all the disagreements, and try to be like, hey, we have some common ground to build from. And how do we find some healing within our community, reconciliation?
I think that the acknowledgement that ours is not a monolithic community in any way, right? That we have so much diversity, not just of ethnicity, of language, of class and circumstance, but also of opinion and political persuasion in our community is an important thing that this book delivers. But I think that one of the things that really hit me hardest was how you actually just dove right into the kinds of tensions that exist within ourselves, right? The kinds of ways in which those of us who are Asian American interlocutors for the community in a lot of ways do have to personally contend with some of these issues and how we're going to live them, how we're going to react to them in our own personal lives. Mm-hmm. And that's in the chapter where you're talking about deciding what school, at this case, I guess with elementary school, that your daughter Tay was going to attend. And you had concerns about putting her into the local school because it, was low performing, all the things that Asian parents, of every background end up kind of getting ingrained into us, whether we personally believe it or not. Our parents have told us this, or our grandparents, and therefore we have to actually use that lens as well. And I mean, that's obviously something which I think each of us as parents have had to contend with as well. But the conversation you had with Todd, with your husband, about this, I thought was really revealing. And I just wanted to kind of pull that up and have you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that conversation, I think, opens and closes the chapter around solidarity efforts. And it really kind of bookended the interviews I had with pro-affirmative action Asian Americans. And my point in opening and closing with this struggle was that solidarity is not easy. It's a hard thing, and it requires a lot of self-examination and reflection. And so that story, that chapter, I think it was chapter 5, right before the conclusion, was, I can't just, the easy thing for me to do was just to be like, celebrate all these people that some of them I'd known a long time too, right? And like, oh, they're pro-affirmative action and like, they're fantastic. But really, I wanted to make it more complicated because I think, Phil, you mentioned earlier, becoming a parent has really shifted, how we approach and think about the world and how to raise a kid. And I think my experiences with having a kid enter Chicago public schools, right? I live in Chicago, and really revealed for me, or even just thinking about it, right? The story that opens that chapter is when Todd and I were dating. And so kids, we weren't even like serious yet. And it was like, we had these conversations about, well, we were starting to get serious and we were like, well, where would you want to raise a family? Right. And he was like, oh, an urban community. And I was like, yeah, I'm down for that. I'm a city girl. Right. And then I was like, where would we want to have our kids go to school? And he was like, well, obviously, whatever neighborhood school is closest. And I was like, isn't that obvious? And I'm an education researcher. And so maybe I know too much about public schools and how troubled they are. But he kind of like challenged me on essentially some of the latent anti-Black, anti-Latinx classist kind of ideas that were underlying the questions I was raising about where we would have our child go to school. And I think that's just one example of, the critical self-examination that is required and what it means. And by no way am I saying like, oh, if you're not down with your local public school, no matter how troubled it is, that then you're not politically down. But I just wanted to kind of share that personal struggle of living out the values we claim.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot in the book that asks us to sort of interrogate where our opinions on all these things, where they're coming from and how we live our lives, One of the really interesting things about the interviews that you did on the pro and against affirmative action debate, these people have their opinions, and a lot of the times, as you note while you're talking about their responses, you're like, well, that was wrong. Well, that was wrong on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And and knowing you, I know it took a lot of effort and energy for you to not correct them on the spot while you were doing doing these interviews. But I think it also highlights the fact that we can be so set in our ways and have ourselves plant our feet and say like, this is right and this is wrong. And if you're not down, then you're not down,
Mm-hmm.
And that happens a lot, especially in progressive Asian American circles. But I think that allowing ourselves to sort of approach it from a more humanistic perspective and being like, look, we contain multitudes. Our community contains multitudes. Our own families contain multitudes. We have to complicate it, We have to complicate it and be okay with interrogating and kind of blowing that up,
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to do. And like, let's embrace all the complexities and messiness, I guess, and see what can be possible going forward.
Well, I just want to commend you so much on the task of writing this. I mean, especially given the fact that you have to cover so much ground. And I will say the first few chapters where you're just kind of laying down essentially the foundational understandings necessary for people to wade into this debate, probably the most lucid and easy to apprehend and comprehend description of the legal background.
There's a lot of history and legal history.
The first half is probably more of the academic voice, right? And I think folks who are really familiar with it, probably, I encourage you, like, you can just glean through that first part because it's some basic information.
It's very necessary, though. It's super necessary. Okay. Yeah, you lay the groundwork.
You really do a great job of, I think, making it, like I said, easy to understand. Again, the only other place where I've seen these things kind of walked through with as much kind of simplicity and clarity is in a book called Rise.
I've heard of it. It's an excellent book. Met the authors too.
Yes, they're pretty cool. One is a very popular blogger, as I understand.
A popular blogger.
Yeah, but not quite as liked by certain Grace in Chicago. So,
but for real, it's a gigantic task, and so full of heart and so full of your own personal memories. Bringing framing it by talking about bringing your daughter to your mom's grave and speaking through even the tradition of Qingming and the context of how, in some ways, the past and the future are intertwined in that regard. That was just a really powerful entry point for this. I really hope that people don't see this, honestly, as just a book about affirmative action, which I know you actually had some questions of whether to include that in the subtitle because of what a third rail it is, right? But it is a book about family, and it's a book about family and culture and race and how those things are intertwined. But yeah, I did want to ask you before we go to break about the decision to use this title. First, the title itself, which, as you noted in the book, Tay actually was the one who came up with the title effectively.
She wanted co-authorship.
Yeah. She wants points.
Yeah. So like when she was 3 in 2018, I was trying to struggle through like, how do I write a book? And I really want to honor these stories. And then one night she's barely verbal. And she's like, Mom, what color are we? Are we black or are we white, essentially? And I was like, oh, we're Asian American. And she was like, yeah, no, I'm 3 years old now. I'm in preschool. I'm learning my colors, and Asian American's not a crayon in the Crayola box. So you're going to need to do better is essentially, the motivation behind the title. And I was like, yeah, she's right. Asian American's not a color. But I was fighting every academic fiber in my being not to go theoretical and be like, you're right, because theoretically, as Omian Wanat would say, or as Yenli Espiritu would say, right? And that just doesn't work for a 3-year-old or people, right? And so I think that was the challenge that parenting offered me in a really great way to motivate me to try to engage with people more and have people, try to be like these authors of Rise and have this book be read by more than like 20 people and engage in ideas and conversation. But like you said, I think affirmative action wasn't originally in the subtitle because I felt like the stories and what I was trying to say goes way farther beyond this wonky policy and the history of what is affirmative action, right? Or about how people get into fancy colleges or how admissions works. I didn't want the book to be that because the stories weren't about that. They were much deeper. But, it was a conversation that the publisher was like, no, we're going to have affirmative action in the title. And I, at the end of the day, I'm okay with it. I really wanted it to be about conversations and family because that's really what the heart and soul was about. And I was really inspired by books like the ones that Ta-Nehisi Coates and Imani Perry wrote to their children, or even Dear Girls. I read Dear Girls as I was by Ali Wong as I was getting ready to write this book or in the process of writing the book. So to me, the heart is that, affirmative action was just kind of a window into a deeper conversation.
Yes, the great race scholars of our time.
Race scholars of our time. Yes, Ali Wong.
Ali Wong. Yes. Fantastic.
All right, this is a good time for us to take a break, but when we return, we will do our favorite segment, the good, the bad, and the WTF. So stick around, we'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Marvin.
And I'm Rira.
And we're the hosts of Books and Boba, a book club and podcast dedicated to books by Asian and Asian American authors.
Each month, we pick a book by an Asian author to read and discuss on the show.
We read a variety of genres, including contemporary and historical fiction, sci-fi and fantasy, romance and cozy mysteries, and so much more.
Our past book club picks have included Pachinko by Minjin Lee, Patron Saints of Nothing by Randy Ribeye, Grace of Kings by Ken Liu, and The Kiss Quotient by Helen Huang.
Every month, we also go through the latest news in Asian American literature, as well as chat with some awesome Asian authors about their works.
So whether you want to start reading for fun again or diversify your TBR list, we got your Asian literature cravings covered. For more info, check out our website at booksandboba.com, and you can listen to us on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and wherever you find your podcasts.
Part of the Potluck Podcast Collective.
And we're back. All right, on the second half of They Call Us Bruce, you know what we do. This is when we do our favorite segment, our signature segment, the good, the bad, and the WTF. So, Jeff Yang, why don't you lay down the rules of engagement for Dr. Poon?
Yes, I will, Dr. Poon. These are the rules, should you accept them, of our game. This, our roundtable segment, is one where we take a single topic and serve it up 3 ways. The first is the positive, the second is the negative, and the third is the thing we're still puzzling over, the thing that makes us go, about that particular topic. And the topic we wanted to dissect in this fashion was the good, the bad, and the WTF of writing Asian American is not a color. So, OiYan, let's start with the positive. What was the good about writing this book?
Yeah, there's so much good. I think it was really, I think for a long time on Facebook and other social media, I've been writing stories of Tay along the way, just kind of like, oh, wow, well, this was a surprising thing that she said in conversation. And so being able to kind of memorialize those conversations and questions in a book was really fun. And I imagine that down the line, she already doesn't remember any of the conversations that I highlighted in the book. And so just having it for both of our memories is really special to me. But also now that the book is done, I have lived in, fun fact about me, all 4 time zones on the continental US. So I've collected them all. And so this, now that the book is out, it's been really amazing and wonderful to reconnect with friends over the last few decades of my life. Like when I was in LA, somebody showed up I hadn't seen in literally 25 years. And it was just really amazing to reconnect with folks and see how people are doing. And so that's been a really great thing about writing the book.
I mean, the book itself is just full of shout outs to community and people, individuals. So that's also really kind of a fun thing to read through.
Mm-hmm.
For those of us who occupy this strata of discourse, shall we say, yeah, a lot of familiar names, a lot of friends, a lot of basically family of ours, and it was great to see those names and their.
It was a love letter to our community.
Yeah.
Well,
sure. We know about love letters. Now to the dark side. What would you say is the bad of writing this book?
I think struggling with recognizing and just confronting some of the, anti-Black, anti-Latino, the racist ideologies that are very much embedded in our communities and having to face them. It's not easy, right? Like, especially, I think you mentioned progressive Asian American communities, and we have to check ourselves on these purity tests. And like, if this is not the future we envision for our community and loved ones, then what are we going to do about it? I mean, it's just hard to confront these things, right? But we have to.
I do love that you illustrated the whole conversation around scarcity mentality with an anecdote about Tay and Taylor, her best friend, both wanting to be Elsa for Halloween. It's like, there can only be one Elsa.
There can only be one.
I was like, whatever, everybody's Elsa. And Anna is cooler anyway. So
exactly.
But I totally get it. This is why my boys were always like, both of them are ninjas. Both of them are superheroes. It's like, you just can't, there's nothing you can do about that. All right, let's go to the final round. The WTF. What is the WTF of writing this book?
I think, the WTF, the thing that I'm still puzzling over is what are we going to do about, how do we embrace the diversity and the multitudes in our community and at the same time check some of these really problematic ideologies and values and perspectives, especially since like we're in another election year. Oh, yay, 2024. And,
a bad rerun, honestly.
Seriously, the worst rerun. The sequel that should never have happened. But, I'm puzzling over and quite frankly, worried about how the conservative right and white supremacist forces are going to be using and leaning into manipulating Asian American grievances around racism. So I don't know about you, but in 2022, I know a lot of Asian American voters, including my own home, that got these mailers from Stephen Miller about how Biden was anti-Asian and the Democrats are like responsible for anti-Asian discrimination and violence. And things like equity is anti-Asian, right? And so that was the first trial run, right, of leading into these divisions in our community. That trial run, they paid $33 million for. So with this election, I'm bracing myself and just pondering and puzzling over what we're going to do as community leaders to come together, hopefully, and overcome this division.
All right. Well, that's our 3 rounds. We did it. Dr. OiYan A. Poon. The book is Asian American is Not a Color, Conversations on Race, Affirmative Action, and Family. OiYan, how can people connect with you online?
You can Google OiYan Poon. I'm pretty much the only one out there. You'll find my website. I am OiYan Poon on Instagram and I think LinkedIn as well. And on Twitter, I'm always still going to be Spam Fried Rice.
Spam Fried Rice. Classic.
It's always going to be Twitter for you too, I can tell. Yes.
It's not going to be X. I paused there, but no, it's not going to be X.
That is understood. Okay. Jeff Yang, how about you? How can people find you online?
I'm Original Spin, anywhere you might find social presence of anything, really. And that includes Threads, Instagram, Facebook. I am originalsp.in on Blue Sky if you frequent that particular platform. But yeah, just search me and you'll find me. Phil, how about yourself? How can people find you?
You can find me at Angry Asian Man on most of the socials. You can also find me on angryasianman.com. You can find They Call Us Bruce at They Call Us Bruce. And if you can, hop on to Apple Podcasts and give us a rating or review. We'd really appreciate it. Helps people find the show. And also, you should check out OiYan's book, Asian American is Not a Color. OiYan, Poon, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for your time. And thank you for your friendship. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Friends forever.
Woo! All right, everybody. Until next time. Peace.
Peace.
Bye.
You've been listening to They Call Us Bruce with Jeff Yang and Phil Yu. Our theme music is by Kiro One. They Call Us Bruce is a member of the Potluck Podcast Collective, featuring unique voices and stories from the Asian American community. Find out more at podcastpotluck.com. And thanks for listening.